1990, the heart of Polish industry stopped beating. Within months, an empire that employed 100,000 workers across 28 specialized factories, the Unitra conglomerate, was effectively erased from the state ledger. For decades, the Unitra badge wasn't just a logo, it was the physical proof of Polish engineering, found on the Neptune television sets that illuminated living rooms from Warsaw to the Carpathian Mountains. Yet by 1992, the production lines were silent. The supply chains, which had once stretched from glass tube foundries to capacitor workshops, had shattered overnight under the pressure of the Privatization Act and a flood of superior, cheaper foreign imports. Thousands of engineers and technicians suddenly found their specialized expertise obsolete. The television sets remained in homes for years, humming their familiar glow, but the company that birthed them had effectively vanished. The irony was total. The badge survived on the front of the cabinets, yet the factories, the repair networks, and the national industrial identity behind it had disintegrated. But the true story of Unitra is not simply one of collapse. It is the story of how an entire nation's window to the world was built, maintained, and ultimately dismantled. Welcome to European Television Brand Memories. We investigate the industrial systems, the human labor, and the domestic rituals that turned a simple glass and circuit machine into a pillar of national life. Today, we trace the rise and fall of Poland's electronics giant. In 1961, Poland faced a singular, overwhelming industrial challenge: how to build a modern electronics sector from the ruins of a post-war economy. The nation needed more than just sporadic factory outputs. It needed a unified system. That year, the state-run association Unitra was formally established. It was not merely a company in the Western sense, but a centralized industrial engine, a conglomerate of 28 specialized factories, research bureaus, and service centers that aimed to cover every facet of the electronics supply chain. For the planners in Warsaw, Unitra represented national self-reliance. The goal was to manufacture everything locally, from the microscopic capacitors and resistors to the glass picture tubes that define the size and quality of the image. By creating a closed-loop system, Poland aimed to bypass the volatile, expensive reliance on Western imports during the height of the Cold War. It was an ambitious, monolithic experiment in socialist industrial planning. Factories were distributed across the country, each assigned a specific role. One facility would master the intricate art of wire-wound coils. Another would focus on the demanding chemistry of cathode ray tube glass. This wasn't just about output, it was about building an indigenous engineering culture from the ground up. Workers didn't just assemble parts, they learned to manipulate the fundamental building blocks of electronics within an environment where the state controlled the entire life cycle of the product. In the living rooms of the 1960s, this meant that the television was not merely a consumer purchase. It was a manifestation of national progress. When a family saved for a Neptune or a Pioneer-branded receiver, they weren't just buying a machine, they were engaging with a product that contained the labor and technology of their own countrymen. It was the start of a deep-seated public trust. The brand was seen as a pillar of reliability, designed to be serviced, repaired, and kept running for years rather than discarded. But as the 1970s arrived, the very structure that had provided this initial stability, the rigid, centralized control, would soon face the first pressure of a globalizing world that moved faster than the state planning committees could account for. The television had entered the home, but the system behind it had yet to face the true cost of its own insularity. By the 1970s, Unitra had achieved a dominance that few other state-led enterprises could claim. The key was the Neptune series, television sets that did more than just broadcast a signal. They defined the aesthetic of the Polish living room. The breakthrough was not a singular invention, but a mastered industrial integration. Unitra had successfully bridged the gap between basic radio manufacturing and the high-precision requirements of mass-market television production. Consider the Neptune 150 or the later, more advanced Neptune 600 series. These were not merely machines. They were massive, wooden-cased pieces of furniture. In an era where living space was often cramped, the television was a prized possession, occupying a place of honor alongside the buffet or the family photo album. For the factory at Gdansk, which became synonymous with the Neptune brand, This meant navigating the immense complexity of CRT production. A picture tube was the most expensive, fragile, and technically demanding component of the set. By controlling its production within the Unitra network, the conglomerate ensured a reliable, if not always cutting-edge, supply chain. While Western consumers were accustomed to rapid design iterations and global supply lines, the Polish consumer faced a different reality, a product designed for longevity and serviceability. When a Neptune set left the factory, it was built with the expectation that it would be repaired, not replaced. The chassis, the intricate web of circuits and components, was designed to be accessible. A local repair technician, armed with a schematic and a standard toolkit, could typically diagnose a fault, swap a capacitor, or resolder a connection. This repairability was not an accident. It was a systemic necessity. With the state economy struggling to import finished consumer goods, the local repair shop became the lifeblood of the Polish household's television experience. Unitra supported this by ensuring that spare parts, while sometimes subject to the notorious shortages of the era, were fundamentally standardized. The breakthrough was thus twofold: a product that was physically robust enough to survive years of operation, and an ecosystem that treated the television as an investment to be maintained. For the average family, the Neptune wasn't just good enough, it was the physical manifestation of the nation's technological ambition. Yet this success concealed a hidden fragility. By focusing on deep integration and domestic self-sufficiency, Unitra was becoming increasingly isolated from the rapid, digital-focused advancements happening in Japan and Germany. The very standardization that made them reliable would soon make them static. As the 1980s approached, the global shift toward color broadcasting and integrated circuitry would begin to test the limits of this centralized industrial model, setting the stage for a technological gap that no amount of national pride could bridge. By the mid-1970s, Unitra had become more than a manufacturer. It was the invisible backbone of Polish domestic life. To walk into an electronics shop in Warsaw or Krakow during this period was to see a retail landscape dominated by the Unitra badge. Yet the true scale of the conglomerate was found away from the showroom floor. It existed in the 28 specialized factories, the engine rooms of Polish electronics, where the rhythmic pulse of industrial production kept the national rhythm. For the Polish family, the television was a significant household investment, often requiring months of savings. This created a unique retail culture centered on durability and professional maintenance. When a consumer purchased a Neptune or Helios television, they weren't just buying a screen. They were entering into a long-term relationship with the Unitra service network. The television was designed to be opened, diagnosed, and repaired. In towns across the country, local repair shops became essential community hubs. Technicians, often formally trained through the state system, were the custodians of this domestic technology. They knew the chassis layouts by heart, possessed the schematics for every major board revision, and maintained a library of spare parts that bridged the gap between the factory and the living room. This ecosystem of repair fostered a deep-seated public trust. A television was not a disposable commodity. It was a permanent fixture, meant to age alongside the family. This was the era of the window to the world, where a Sunday evening broadcast or major national event turned the television into a focal point of the home. The warmth of the wooden cabinets, the distinct smell of warm dust and electronic components, and the familiar clicking of the mechanical channel selectors became deeply woven into the fabric of memory for a generation. However, the midpoint of this story reveals the hidden fragility of the entire operation. The very things that made Unitra strong, the deep integration of local factories, the reliance on internal component supply, and the culture of repair were also the sources of its structural rigidity. The conglomerate was a closed loop. While it successfully shielded the Polish consumer from the immediate fluctuations of global markets, it also isolated Polish engineering from the radical shifts in transistor technology and digital signal processing occurring in the West. The stakes were clear. The loss of Unitra would not just be the loss of a brand or a product line, it would be the erosion of an entire national industrial infrastructure. It would mean the disappearance of thousands of specialized vocational roles, the collapse of the repair networks that sustain local businesses, and the erasure of an engineering identity that had spent 2 decades proving it could manufacture high-tech equipment in the heart of Central Europe. The system was reaching its zenith, but behind the scenes, the reliance on monolithic state planning was creating a technological debt that would become impossible to repay. The crack didn't appear as a sudden fracture, but as a slow, agonizing erosion. By the mid-1980s, the Unitra system, once a paragon of self-sufficiency, was struggling to maintain the pace of global technological change. The first small cracks were visible, not in the balance sheets, but in the shop windows. Foreign sets, smuggled or imported in small batches, began to appear in private hands. They were smaller, thinner, and boasted vibrant color saturation that the aging Neptune and Helios lines struggled to replicate. The centralized planning of the PRL, which had once been the engine of growth, became the anchor of stagnation. While competitors in Asia and the West were shifting toward integrated circuits and rapid manufacturing cycles, Unitra remained locked into a supply chain that favored massive, durable, but increasingly obsolete cathode ray tubes. The cost of upgrading these massive glass foundries to meet new global standards was prohibitive, especially as the state economy faced mounting shortages. When the political and economic system shifted in 1989, the shock was total. The Privatization Act of 1990 did not just reform the conglomerate, it dismantled the very logic of its existence. The 28 factories, once nodes in a unified national organism, were suddenly forced to compete as individual, often debt-ridden entities in a market flooded with Sony, Philips, and Samsung. The supply chain collapsed within months. Without the state-mandated demand for every capacitor and wire, the internal network disintegrated. Production lines that had hummed for decades fell silent. The repair shops, the lifeblood of the Unitra experience, could no longer source parts. When a family's television finally failed, the local technician was no longer an expert with a drawer full of spares. He was a relic in a landscape of disposable, imported electronics. The human consequence was a silent exodus of talent. Thousands of engineers who had spent their lives mastering the nuances of signal processing and CRT calibration found their skills irrelevant in a world of modular, imported plastic. The factories were liquidated, privatized, or sold for scrap. The Unitra badge, once a mark of national pride, was now being peeled off the cabinets of sets that were being hauled to the dump. By the late 1990s, the empire was a ghost. The massive plants in Gdańsk, Warsaw, and elsewhere were repurposed or demolished. The television sets remained in homes, slowly fading, but the industrial architecture that birthed them was gone. The transition was complete. Poland had moved from a producer of domestic electronics to a market for global imports. The window to the world had changed, and with it, the entire industrial identity of a generation. Today, the name Unitra exists in a space far removed from the smokestacks and assembly lines of the 1970s. In 2021, the trademark was relaunched by a group of private investors, pivoting the brand away from mass-market televisions and into the boutique world of high-end audio. This modern Unitra does not build CRT televisions. It crafts premium amplifiers and audio equipment, emphasizing design and craftsmanship over volume. It is a striking transformation. The historic conglomerate, the engine of 100,000 workers, has been replaced by a sleek, modern entity that bears the name but lacks the industrial footprint of its predecessor. The original factories are long gone, and the repair networks of the past have been superseded by centralized warranty services. Yet for many in Poland, the name still holds a resonance that no corporate rebrand can fully manufacture. Collectors still treasure the original Neptune and Helios sets, not because they perform better than modern screens, but because they represent a tangible piece of a vanished industrial world. These sets are more than electronics. They are time capsules. They carry the smell of the old workshops and the memories of a generation that gathered around a single glowing screen to watch the world change. This is not nostalgia. It is a recognition of the sheer industrial ambition that once turned a nation's engineering talent into a household fixture. The televisions were the physical proof that Poland could build its own future, circuit by circuit. While the factories are silent and the repair bench is empty, the legacy lives on in the forums where enthusiasts share schematics and in the way the Unitra badge is still treated with a respect reserved for few other consumer goods. The final physical image remains etched in the minds of those who lived through it. A wooden-cased Neptune set in a quiet living room, the faint, high-pitched hum of the vacuum tube, and the rhythmic, satisfying click of a mechanical channel selector. A sound that, for many, was the very heartbeat of a home.